Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you another review video. This time I'm talking horror and thriller books, and well, if I had a theme this week, it would be sociopaths and serial killers, which obviously has some overlap. And yeah, apparently I went back down that rabbit hole again, and I can't apologize. I found some great books, some underhyped gems, and yeah, let's talk about them. Let's get started. First, let's talk about Psycho by Robert Bloch, and this is a very iconic horror thriller classic that I read with my Patreon book club, which is always linked down below if you want to join us. I think just about everyone except me knew the premise of this one. Essentially, we follow a young woman, Mary, who stumbles upon this old shabby motel and decides to spend the night because it's storming, and there she meets the owner or manager of the hotel, Norman Bates, who lives there with his mother. And I knew absolutely nothing about this because as I said in my TBR video, I have not watched the movie, and that is still true as of the time of filming this. But after reading the book, I'm definitely more interested in checking out the iconic film. And I will say that I really enjoyed this one. So it was a lot of fun to go into this one absolutely blind. I had no idea what was going to happen and what the plot points were going to be. That being said, I will admit that the book is fairly predictable for someone who reads a lot of modern thrillers. You will kind of see the tropes as they are happening and be able to guess what is going to happen next. But because it's a classic, I feel like I can't criticize the book for that, and I thought it was very well done, the tropes that it played out, and I imagine that this book is probably one of those iconic books that kind of popularized or even possibly created some of those tropes, so I again can't complain. It just made it really fun to kind of watch it all unfold. I love sociopathic characters and getting to see a narrative of one that is just very well done. I love getting inside the head of that individual and getting to see the complexities of the situation. I almost don't want to say more, even though again I'm probably the last person on the internet to not know what this book is all about, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was well done. I love the ending, which is not something I often can say when it comes to horror books. I just thought it was great from start to finish, and it was really short, which is probably my biggest predictor of if I'm going to like a horror book. Is if you notice my favorites, they tend to lean on the side, not always the case, but usually on the side of short books, and this one was just short and sweet. It had a point, it got there, it said what it needed to do, and not a lot more, and I was really impressed. I'm interested in reading Psycho 2, so let me know if that one is worth reading or if that's one of those sequels that kind of misses the mark. Next we have The Perfect Son by Freida McFadden, and this is a story that's told over a few different points of view, but primarily we follow a mother who loves their son, who they consider to be absolutely perfect, even though they know that their son actually does have some flaws, but they are just very much in love with their son, and if anything actually struggle to love their daughter the same amount. They're supposed to love all their children the same way, but maybe that isn't always the case in parent-child relationships, and so we follow this mother who is trying to protect her son from himself because she knows that he has a past history of some very complicated incidents that have happened in the past, and well, basically we as a reader right from the beginning start to notice that he seems to have some supposed sociopathic tendencies, let's say. And so the mother is kind of aware of this and then is just trying to protect him from getting in trouble. And so at the beginning of the book, he expresses some interest in a young woman, and the mother tries to kind of busy her way in and stop this from happening, and well, things go crazy from there. I don't want to say more. I actually don't know how much was on the back of the book. I picked up this one pretty blind off of Libby, and I am just really happy to say that I enjoyed it a lot. You know me, if you follow my channel, that I'm very, very picky and critical when it comes to thrillers. I have seen them done over and over again, and while I love the idea of a creepy kid narrative, I find that it's so rarely done well, at least to my taste, and this one actually worked really well for me. I thought that the son was very compelling and complex as a character. I liked the mother. There were a few scenes, I will admit, that caused me to kind of have to suspend my disbelief. There's a scene where the family is in complete crisis and then the mother goes off to a PTA meeting, and it just seemed really unbelievable that you wouldn't just blow that off given what was happening at the time. But despite some moments that were just a little too perfect, a little bit of the author probably trying to tie the book all together and give us a particular ending. But that being said, this book had some fun twists and turns that I did see coming and not see coming all at the same time, and just enjoyed the ride. So I will say it's perhaps not the most unpredictable thriller because you kind of know the son is not great, but because of that, it just makes it really enjoyable if you just enjoy following along those kind of narratives, which I do. So I really like this one. Again, these are the kind of books that often totally miss the mark for me, so I was really happy and pleasantly surprised when this one worked really well, and I had a lot of fun reading it. Next is Into the Black Nowhere by Meg Gardiner, and this is a thriller book that is technically the second book in a series, but it's really a companion series. The first book is Unsubbed, which I didn't read, and I believe all I missed out by not reading that book is some kind of character progression with some relationships, all of that, which I didn't care about anyway. But it didn't spoil the first book, at least not to my understanding. I jumped into book 2 because of the particular slant of the plot. So basically in this thriller we follow an investigator who is following after this serial killer and trying to track them down. And this particular serial killer has a certain MO, and it gets very particular how this book is written. So I will say that they end up very early on targeting a particular man who they believe might be the suspect. His ex-girlfriend comes to the police believing that he might be the one. They aren't completely sure because the make of his car is a little bit different than what is previously described, but he's very charismatic, he's very likable, he's very suave, and he works for a suicide hotline and just seems to be, I don't know, a little bit too perfect. And so the book follows them as they try to investigate and figure out if this is the man that they are after. Now, this is the kind of book that is not really meant to be a surprise. I wouldn't call this book a mystery because I think any reader following this book will know who has done it from the very beginning, and it's really not about figuring out who done it. It's more about a character study. And if you recognize some of the clues that I put into that synopsis, you can probably guess that while this book is fiction, it's heavily inspired by the real life of Ted Bundy and his crimes. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you know that I went down the Ted Bundy rabbit hole earlier this year, going into a lot of the really iconic true crime books in the genre. And so it was really fun to get to read a fictionalized version of that. And I will say that it's really heavy-handed. It's really obvious that it is supposed to be him. And I think it's even in a lot of the marketing, so that's not a spoiler. And you're basically following him. And like I said, if you're familiar with the details of the crime, which I now am after reading so many books, there were so many little nuggets put in there. And that is kind of my criticism of this book. Was it fun to read? Absolutely, for someone like myself who's fascinated by Ted Bundy. But my criticism would be the fact that this book is very predictable and not really fresh, and the author basically leaned on knowing that the audience would be fascinated by a fictional telling of this, which did work. I admit that I was fascinated by the book, but I don't really feel like it shows a lot of creativity, a lot of master of storytelling when you're just retelling a story and calling it fiction. So I will say that I had fun with this book. From a literary standpoint, as a book reviewer, I do have to criticize it for just being a little bit of a cheat of a book, but it was fun. It was a fun little getaway and an easy book to fly through. Then we have Heartsick by Chelsea Cain, and this is the first book in what I believe is a pretty long-running series. We follow a man named Archie, who you find out in the past was part of this investigation of this beauty killer, and he ended up tracking her down, but he got caught by her. And this is all in the prologue and beginning, so it's not a spoiler whatsoever. Essentially, she caught him, tortured him, and was going to kill him, but then decided not to and actually let him go, and he is the reason that she is now in prison. And so we follow him now in the present day, trying to cope with what happened. He is addicted to drugs and is just really struggling to move on with his life. And there is just a strange dynamic between him and this woman Gretchen. And the story kind of picks up because there's another criminal act that is taking place that kind of ties in with that, and so they call him back onto the force. And I will say that the actual present day mystery and crime was very boring and flat. I don't think the characters are very great. I thought the prose was very weak. There are a lot of things I want to criticize about this book, but I will say that the relationship, the absolutely toxic, messed up relationship between the serial killer and this detective was fascinating. The scenes, the flashbacks were dark and gruesome and terrifying. The torture is on the page, and I was very scared for the character, and it's just a very compelling setup. I think it's just so messed up, and it's a really fun thought experiment to say what would happen if this were to take place. And so I like the idea of it. I did like those scenes, but the rest of the book was incredibly weak, and I can't give the book a high rating just because I definitely saw the flaws, and I kind of read it because I wanted to experience that little nugget of plot, but the rest of the book was oh so weak. So I probably won't continue on with the series, but I'm glad I checked it out because I've always been fascinated about this really messed up premise that I've always heard buzzing around on BookTube and online in general. Next, I want to talk about How to Survive Your Murder by Danielle Valentine, which I received for review from a publisher. And this is a YA horror book, and you know that I am more cautious when it comes to reading YA these days, but this is one that caught my attention because this author also writes under the name Danielle Vega. And so this is the same author who wrote one of my favorite iconic YA horror books. And I really wanted to check out her newest one because I find that she tends to write books that, while they're written for a YA audience, definitely have all ages or adult appeal. The basic synopsis of this one is that we follow a young woman or teenager whose sister was brutally murdered on Halloween a year ago, and now the story is taking place in the present day when she's attending the courtroom trial. And when she falls asleep or basically passes out, she ends up waking up and finding out that it is a year prior, it is Halloween again, her sister's alive, and she somehow has to try to figure out if she can stop the events from happening again. I think that the plot and premise is really amazing. It seems like the kind of book that would be great to be translated into a fun, like, Netflix movie. I will say I had a lot of fun with this book, and while I don't think it is quite as good or to my taste as her backlist titles, I still thought that this was really enjoyable. I flew through it. It was a lot of fun. And I really think it'll appeal to anyone who just loves horror books about Halloween and slashers and is just very self-aware of the genre and the love for the genre. So yeah, I thought it was a lot of fun and definitely one that I think will appeal to readers of all age, although especially I would love to put this in the hands of any teenager that loves this genre. Next, I want to talk about Cradle by K.A. Caskabel, and this is a horror thriller book that is basically a piece of pandemic fiction, so content warnings for those of you that need to separate yourself from that particular genre. I know I personally go in and out of love with it. I sometimes can read it and sometimes just can't. This book starts out with a virus that is causing the death of many people, including many children, and so the prologue itself is very hard to read, and I actually started this book earlier in the year and put it down and then only returned to it because I felt like I was in a better headspace to try it again, and I'm glad I did. I did enjoy a lot about this book. It does deal with a lot of social commentary, so it's a book that follows a lot of different characters and basically leads through how they all deal with the events and how they came through this pandemic season. And I like that the book has a lot of strong female characters. It has a lot of different cultural references. You have characters that really are dealing with prejudice and racial divide and things like that, and just lots of different things thrown in there, like sexual assault and all of these different content warnings. So I like the book because I felt very nuanced in that way. It kind of reminded me of The Living Dead by George A. Romero and Daniel Kraus, because it's another book that is kind of pandemic fiction, but then it's more almost about the characters than the pandemic. But what I will say is that this book is pretty long, and while I liked the beginning, I did feel like it started to meander too much. And so I liked a lot about this book. It wasn't quite the favorite I was hoping it would be, but I definitely see its potential, and depending on what you look for when you're looking at horror fiction, if it's more a way to study humanity through horror and scary events, then you might appreciate this book. If you're looking for the focus to be on the virus itself, that's not necessarily what you'll get with this book. So keep that all in mind and decide for yourself. And I also read Meddling Kids by Edgar Cantero, and this is a pretty fun horror book that is basically a fun spin on Scooby-Doo. We follow a group of individuals. Basically, as children, they were solving mysteries and they would figure out who was behind all of these mysterious events that seemed like horror but turned out to actually be some old guy behind a mask and so forth. And so the story is actually told as they are older now and are young adults and are coming back together to try to solve another case. And it was just a really fun book in terms of its nods to Scooby-Doo. I haven't really watched much of the show. I've seen the bad movie adaptation like 3 times, but I don't know why that happened. But anyway, as for the book itself, I found it fun, but I wished it had been shorter. I tend to find books like this just too long when they're dealt with in a more lighthearted, funny tone. I just find that I get tired of kind of that sickly sweet, funny tone very easily. And so I think I would have enjoyed this book more if it had been really short, like maybe 200 pages. For me, it dragged a little bit. I did appreciate the queer representation, including some trans rep, which is something I don't see enough in my fiction. But in terms of the story, it kind of fell flat for me. I liked it, but honestly, it's just not the kind of story I think I'm personally capable of loving, because I much prefer fiction that is dark and devastating and brutal, and that's just not what this book is. I wanted to check it out, but I went into it knowing that it wasn't really likely to be a favorite, and well, it wasn't. So that's it for this video. I would love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to hear, what is your favorite book about a sociopath or a serial killer? I think I've read a lot of the iconic ones at this point, but I'm always interested to add more to my TBR, and maybe we could do like a top 10 serial killer video. Would anyone be interested in that? All that being said, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and sometimes I'm reading true crime as well. And if you want to help me out, you can give this video a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji of a serial killer, whatever that looks like. And if you want to help me out more, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.